In this video, I want to talk about local storage, and local storage is a way for us to store data inside of the browser. So when you open up an app and then you close it and open up again in the same browser, you will have access to some shared persistent data. And so in this class, because we haven't learned databases yet, local storage gives us a nice way to pretend like we are, saving the user's data somewhere in a persistent way. And so it allows us to kind of mock up applications that we'll be able to build later when we learn how to use databases. So local storage, this is an API that is part of JavaScript and the browser APIs. So the way that it works is that it is a key value store, which means that we specify a key and we say it's this value, like we say name and the value is Mike. That gets stored in our browser, and anytime we ask for name, we're going to get back whatever value we stored. One of the important points here is that the key and value are always going to be string formats. So if you try and store a number in there, you're actually going to be storing a string when you get it back later. So the syntax, there are a couple of methods that you get off of the storage, the local storage in the browser. So there's setItem, where you specify the key and the value. And then when you call getItem later, using that key, you get back whatever value you put in there. So here that would have been Tom. You can also remove an item from local storage to get rid of it. And there is a clear method to clear all of the local storage for your application. So for demo purposes, I don't want to spin up a whole new Create React app to show this. So what I'm going to do is use this service codesandbox.io, which gives us a Visual Studio Code interface for working with projects. And when you go to Code Sandbox, you can create a sandbox and choose a template. There, let me go back. So when you create a template, make sure you choose the React template. There are a lot of different templates that are part of Code Sandbox, but the React template gives us a stripped down version of a React application. So it doesn't give us as much as Create React app does, but it installs React and React DOM and sets things up so that we have this index file that is rendering an app component to our page, and our app component has just some bare bones stuff in it. And if you edit any of this, you get live reloading in the browser over here. So this browser window gives you a view of your application running, and you can actually grab this URL and go to it in another page to see it running full screen. Also with Code Sandbox, over here on the left-hand side, you have your dependencies. These are the things that have been installed in your package.json. So they're installed here. So in Code Sandbox, if you wanted to add a new dependency, like we did in our Create React app local projects where we npm installed something, here you can just search for React Router DOM. Like if that's the dependency you want to add, click on it and it gets added and installed into your project. Okay, so that's an overview of Code Sandbox. What I want to do for local storage is just go back to index.js. Let's comment out all of this. So I'm selecting it all, hitting Control/ to comment it out. So we basically just have a vanilla JavaScript file here that we can work with. And we can use the local storage API. So setItem in local storage, we give it a key value pair. So the first one is what is the name, what is the key of this data. And then the second one is what is the value. So when I finished here and I refresh my browser to clear the console, those errors are gone that were appearing as I was typing. So local storage stored the value of Mike. And then if I want to get it back, put in that key again, and then I can print out the player's name is name. So we can see printing out here, player's name is Mike. Let me clear the console and do this again. Player's name is Mike. we could also store something like score. And if we try and put a number in here, and then let's get it back, const score equals localStorage dot get item score. So what I'm printing out here, let's refresh this, get a clear console. I've got the player's name, I've got the player's score printing out, and it looks like it's a number, except that if I check the type using the type of operator, I can see that that is a string. So if I try to do something like add, let's do, if I tried to do something like do math with score, we'll actually end up having a problem here. We can see the new score is 5010 as opposed to 60. If we try to get something that we haven't stored in local storage, so let's say the items, let's grab localStorage.get log the player's items are. If we try and grab something that's not there, we're actually getting null printing out. So if you try to use a key that doesn't exist, or you make a typo as you were trying to access something, you're going to get null back from local storage. Inside of the browser, if we open the developer tools and we go to the application tab, we have the ability to inspect the storage. So there are a couple different types of storage. We're only talking about local storage in this application or in this video. So if we expand local storage, we can see the two domains that have been loaded. So we have Code Sandbox, which is the application we're running in. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that that company has stored inside of local storage. And if we click on this one, which matches our browser URL, we can see the data that we stored. So there's score of 50, there's player name Mike. And if we keep this open and change this, player name is now Jane. We can see the player name over here in local storage has changed. So this, I believe test is coming from Code Sandbox. You can ignore that one, but our keys and our values are being injected here. And we can clear all of them if we wanted, or we could, let's run this again to get those values back. I could selectively delete one of them, or I could click and change one of them. So this, we'll pop this open again when we build our React version, but this is useful, especially if you end up in development adding a bunch of stuff to local storage and you end up in a broken state because of that data that's in there. You can go ahead and open your developer tools, go into your domain, and clear all of that data to get a fresh version of your application. Okay. So this was all for demo purposes of local storage. So I'm going to copy this out, comment this out, and call this local storage demo. And then we want to get our application running again. So I'm going to reload the React parts of this application and then go to my app.js. And into this, we can do a simple demo of like a user field, a username field or something along those lines. So I'm going to create an input of type text. Let's put a label around it. And have this say enter user, or let's just say enter name. And set this up with some state. So I'm going to create name and set name, and bring in the useState method from React or useState function. So this hook allows us to create some state. And as I typed this and hit tab to autocomplete, it auto-imported. So make sure you've got that imported at the top of your file if you're following along. Let's add an H1 here while we're at it. Local storage demo. So now I can take this name and apply it as the value for our input, and then we're going to need a onNameChange method or function here. This will call set name with event.target.value. So now we can pass that into the onChange prop for our input. These should be hooked up together now, so that if I start typing in here, our state should update, and this name value is now our piece of state for driving this input. This warning here, if I refresh the page, that warning goes away. That was from a previous version. It was running every time I was typing. So sometimes you'll get errors there that are no longer, or errors there that are stale, that no longer apply to your application. Okay, so we've got our input as we've had previously. And what we want to do now is make sure that this gets set in our name variable, but that we also store this into local storage. So what I'm going to do here is localStorage dot set item name. I'm going to pass in the event.target.value. So if I refresh this and I open up my developer tools to that application tab again, and keep this open so that I can see the keys and values for our domain. If I start typing in and editing things, every time that name changes, we are setting the latest value into local storage. So right now, we are storing it into local storage. We can see it over here in our local storage, but if I refresh the page, it doesn't load as local storage. Whoop. Let's close our developer tools. There's an error that was being triggered from the code sandbox code, not our code, that my developer tools was catching. So yours shouldn't be doing that. Don't worry about that. So refreshing this page, our name didn't actually get loaded here. And so what we need to do is make sure that when we initialize our state, we also pull from local storage. So initial name is equal to localStorage.getItem name. We're going to run into a slight problem here that we saw before, get item. If we do this when there is no key in our local storage, then we're going to get back a value of null. And we don't want to set our state to be null. We want it to be an empty string if there's nothing there. So maybe a better way to do this, we could set our initial name to an empty string, and we can check if local storage does not equal null. If it doesn't equal null, then we can set our initial name to be localStorage.getItem name. So then if we take this initial name variable, which is either going to be an empty string, or if we have something in local storage, it will be that value in local storage, and pass that in as our use state. If I refresh the page, the first thing that shows up is now going to be whatever's in local storage. So if I change this to be something else and refresh the page, that value is still there. And if I open up my developer tools And let's slide this over. So I've got the name here. If I go ahead and delete that and then refresh the page, we should now, again, it's catching on an error in Code Sandbox, so I'm going to close my developer tools to stop that breakpoint. So now that we've refreshed after deleting that key, this input is now clear. So we can see all of this in a new tab. So if we open up the URL that we're given here for our React application and look at it in a new tab, we can get rid of some of those errors that are coming from Code Sandbox. And we can see in local storage just that URL that we've got currently. So if I type in my name, refresh this, we can see my name showing up still. And if I clear that out of local storage and run it again, we can see that this would be as if there was nothing in local storage because it's all been cleared. So a couple caveats to keep in mind with local storage. If I go back to the local storage page and come up to the top here, it's saying that local storage allows us to access storage by the domain's origin. So if I click on origin, it gives us some examples. So an origin is the scheme, HTTP, HTTPS, the host, like example.com down here, and then the port or the URL that you are accessing the website or app from. So if you had an application with multiple pages and you tried to access local storage on index.html in app 1 and index.html in app 2, you would be able to. Those would be shared. But if you tried to access two different applications that are on the same host, example.com, but have different schemes, the protocols, HTTP versus HTTPS, these each have a different version of storage in local storage and cannot share data between them. Same thing for different hosts. If you have your website hosted or your app hosted at two different services, they're not going to be able to share data across those services, or different ports. Normally, you're not going to end up writing a port number in your URLs in your browser, but if you did and you had different ports, you would not end up having the same local storage. So for instance, if you're running Create React App, you run it the first time and you're on port 3000, and then another time you're on port 8080, you will not have access to the storage that was there for that different port. So this also means that if we take our application, when we're doing local development, we're on localhost and a port number, and we deploy that to a service like Vercel, the data that is in our local, that is associated with our local host and our port is not going to be there when we go to Vercel, and vice versa. If you do something in Vercel and you have local storage there, it's not going to be in your local host version, your development version of your application. So this is specific to Chrome, the browser that you're in, and the scheme, the host, and the port. So let's demo that. And if I put in a name here, and then I go ahead and open up, say, Firefox, and go to this, that local storage is separate. So Firefox has its own place where it stores this data. It is not shared with the Chrome version of this data. If I were to pull out my phone, a different device, and try and access that, my phone will have its own data associated with it. So in terms of your final projects, if you're thinking about using local storage, the idea is to think of it as a single user's, like the current user's data that you're putting in there. Okay, so the last thing that I want to wrap up with here is this that we're running into here, or that we're doing here and saw here, where if we store a number and try and get that number back, it's actually a string. So this is fine because the name that we're storing is a string. But if we wanted to store an array into local storage, or we wanted to store a number into local storage, then we actually have to take control of making sure that the state that we store into local storage, that we turn it from, say, an array into a string, and then when we get it back, we convert it from a string back into an array. And in JavaScript, there's a set of two commands. There's JSON parse, which will allow you to take a string and convert it into a JavaScript value. So here, this example, we have a object in string format. We're parsing it, and then we're able to retrieve those values. So 42 is converted into a number, and result is converted into a Boolean. So there's JSON.parse that allows you to take a string, turn it into JavaScript, and there's JSON stringify, which allows you to take, say, an object here and stringify it and turn it into a string. So these two together will allow you to do that kind of serialization and deserialization to take your data into string for local storage and then convert it back to a value for you to use. But there's also a library that is already set up to essentially do that for you. So that is what I would recommend you do for your final project. So the React use library here, this has a whole bunch of different hooks. These are custom hooks, like our useState hook, that allow us to do a whole bunch of different things. And the one that we're using here to do local storage is called useLocalStorage. The way that it works is you use local storage, you specify your key and your initial value, and it gives you back a variable with that value, whatever is the current value in local storage, and a setter to change that value. So this is basically like how we said use state, except use state doesn't sync to local storage, and this version syncs to local storage anytime we change it. It also gives us a third parameter here for removing an item from local storage. So if you call this method, it will remove this key from local storage. So what we're going to do is install React Use and then set that up in our application. So if you're running in a Create React app on your local machine, you would just open up a terminal and npm install React Use. In Code Sandbox, I just search for React Use, click on it. It's going to take a second. It's now installed. It's in my package.json. And then I can go ahead and follow this guide here. So I want to import useLocalStorage in curly brackets from React Use. This is a named export. So import useLocalStorage from React Use. And then I set it up like we did with useState, where we're going to pass in an initial value, but we're also going to pass in a key. So I am going to refactor this. I'm going to get rid of the code that we wrote. Instead of using state, I'm going to use local storage. So name, set name, and remove name come from useLocalStorage, where I specify the key. So here I want to store this as name, and the default value I am going to say is an empty string. So we could omit this remove name since we're not really using it. I'm going to leave it here for the purposes of completeness so that you have an idea that it's there. But this code should do exactly what we had previously. So if I type in Mike, refresh the page, Mike is still there. And if I pop this open in a new window and check it out in my storage, we can see that as I am typing names, they are syncing to local storage. The advantage of useStorage is that it also handles parsing, doing that JSON parse and JSON stringify for you. So if we added another field here, so I'm just going to copy and paste this, and let's have score, input of type number. I'm going to create local storage for score. and we're going to default score to be 0. Let's create a onScoreChange function, and we're going to set score using number.parseInt event.target.value. So here we are setting the score, and we are setting it using the parseInt method to take whatever is in that input, which is a string, turn it into a number, and then store it into our score useLocalStorage variable. So let's hook this up to our input. And these, let's clean this up so that we can get them on 2 separate lines. I'm going to create a div around this first one and a div around this second input. So showing up on 2 separate lines. And actually this, if I hover over this, it's telling me that I forgot to pass the second parameter here for parseInt. And when you want to specify how you're parsing an int, usually what you want is 10, so base 10 as the way that you're parsing it. Okay, so we've got our score, we've got our input, make sure that the value is set to score. Pass in 25, reload this, we can see 25 is staying there. And what we can also check is console.log type of score. So this is printing out and showing us that the score is actually a number. So useLocalStorage is doing the nice thing of making sure that whatever we give to it is converted to a string when it's put into local storage, and it's parsed back into a JavaScript value when it's pulled out of local storage. Which means we can do fun things like actually create an array that is synced to local storage too. Like if you did items, give it an empty array, set items, remove items, and I print out our items variable. It is an empty array. If I create, let's do a div here. And create a button. And I'm going to create a function up here, const on add click. Let's do set items. I'm going to take the existing items and then just add like, let's say that this is an RPG and we're adding a sword when they click. Let's make this add sword click and rename this to be add sword. And we're still printing out items here, so we should see every time this application renders what the current items array is. If I add a sword, we see we have an array with sword in it. And if I do this same kind of process with maybe add shield, replicate this and do add shield click and throw in a shield. Whoops. Type that correctly. Click add shield. Whoops. Make sure we save this and make sure that we have these two linked together. So this should be On click, we call this method. So we've got sword from last time, add a shield. Now we've got a shield, add another sword. So the advantage of using this external library is that it handles the parsing and the stringify and parse for us. And that should be enough to get you going in your final projects with using local storage. Remember that it is specific to the origin that you're on, and the best way to think about it is it's just like temporary storage for a single user, the user who is using your app currently. You can either take control yourself and use local storage directly and use parse and stringify to make sure that you're storing strings and you are parsing those strings back into values, or you can use React use and bring in the local storage hook to have all of that wrapped up for you, and all you have to think about is creating your state and still using it like you've used it before, where you read the value and anytime you change it, you use the set function that comes back to mutate that local storage value. So this is very similar to useState. It just syncs to local storage. So I'm going to end it here. You can use either of these approaches in your final project. Good luck.